everybody. Thanks for joining us on From the Ground Up. My name is Megan Hopper, and I am a board-certified behavior analyst and one of the co-hosts of our podcast, where we spend a lot of time talking about autism, faith, and family. My co-host, Scott, is a dad of a child with autism, and we had the opportunity, our last episode, to chat with your wonderful and beautiful daughter, Chloe, who is a speech language pathologist. And
a rock star.
She is a rock star.
Yes. And by the way, Megan, I'm afraid I'm going to be a little bit intimidated by the people on this program. As some of you may see, that Megan and Chloe have all these like alphabet letters after their names. So I had to add a few. Now, you guys wouldn't let me put all the things I wanted to put up there, but these are ladies that really have a lot of expertise, and you're going to hear a lot of expertise tonight. I'm just going to sit in the background and listen to what you guys have to say. Okay. So I'm going to be the quiet dad in the background.
We want you to join our group, so I appreciate the letters behind your name.
Sure.
Those were very
well earned. Yeah, absolutely.
I loved that Chloe shared her story and her journey as a sibling of a child with autism. I think so often that we focus on the parents, we sometimes forget about the siblings.
I can tell you this, she's not just the sibling of an autistic kid. She works with autistic kids every single day and does just a fantastic job with it. And I think you're going to learn tonight that she's got some great advice for how you can get the most out of a speech therapist that's working with your child, and how to really look for somebody that's going to get the most out of your child in those therapy sessions. So I'm excited about what she's going to talk about. I don't understand about half of it, but I'm excited about what she's going to talk about. So.
Well, being one that has worked with a lot of families and kids, I know that so many parents, they take their children to receive speech therapy services, but a lot of times they don't know what that means. They just do that because the diagnosing provider said, hey, your child needs speech therapy. And so I think it'd be really important for us to kind of jump into another episode with Chloe and just find out a little bit more of what should parents be looking for as they're looking into speech therapy. What are the first questions they ask? And maybe she can share some insight on some approaches she's used and seen successful with kids as well. So Chloe, I'm so excited you're here with us. Look at all her fancy letters behind her name.
I know.
Yeah. Just want to be impressive, I guess.
Well, Chloe, last episode, you talked a little bit about your journey as a sibling of an individual with autism and talked about how that kind of led to your journey to be a speech therapist. But we may not have had some folks that heard that episode. So would you kind of talk to us a little bit more about your background, your experience, and kind of how it led you to becoming a speech therapist?
Absolutely. So I was 9 years old when my brother Colby was born, and was in the 5th grade when he was diagnosed with autism. So about halfway through those formative years, autism came into our lives and changed our family forever. We immediately had therapists coming in and out of our house. We were driving hours every single day to take him to different therapy services that he needed. So I got to see a lot of different therapies throughout the years and got to observe therapists and ask questions and absorb all of this information. And it is part of the reason why I decided to become a speech pathologist myself and get to work with kids with autism, as well as lots of other disorders. But I'm very passionate about this field and find what we do to be so interesting. I shared this on the last episode, but the more and more that I learn about speech and language, the more fascinated I am that any of us are able to do it. So I'm really excited to share more about what it is we can do and to support these families tonight.
Awesome. Well, Chloe, from my shoes as a BCBA, I've talked with a lot of families, and we say, what other therapies are your kids in? And most of them will say speech therapy, but they don't really know what that means. They just tend to make the correlation that my child is limited language or they're not talking, so speech therapy is what they need. So could you talk a little bit about specifically what speech therapy is, what it can address? I know sometimes even parents that have a child that's talking, they're like, oh, they don't need speech because they're talking, but there's so many other things that speech therapy can address. And I think it's really important we kind of get that out there for families to know the vast spectrum of things that speech therapy does work with.
Absolutely. So there are so many different aspects of speech and language that we can cover. And I think it's important first to say that if you hear terms like speech therapy, speech and language therapy, or like a speech therapist, speech language pathologist, it's all the same. We're talking about the same things. So a speech therapist can help work with, well, as you see, these are just some of the things that we can work with really, but most people understand that speech therapists can work with speech sound disorders. So if a kid has a lisp, or if they can't say their R sound, or just maybe there's different patterns that make them unintelligible. That's what people think of in a classic sense. But there's so much more to communication than just saying our sounds right. So there's stuttering and fluency. There's the expressive language, which is the ability to communicate our thoughts and ideas. There's receptive language, which is understanding the words that are in our environment. And you'll see across from that, writing and reading, which the most simple way I can explain that is that writing is our way of expressively communicating our language through text, and reading is our receptive understanding of text. So reading and writing is just another form of expressive and receptive language. Voice disorders, social pragmatic language, this comes up quite a bit in autism. Dysarthria, which is like a weakness or paralysis in the muscles that makes it difficult to produce. Childhood apraxia of speech, which is no weakness, but having trouble planning and coordinating the movements of speech. We also work on swallowing, which is also called dysphagia, because we are the masters of everything that's happening in this part. Swallowing is happening in the mouth and down to the throat, so we can do therapy to help support with various aspects of swallowing. The child is hearing impairment or deaf. There is a lot that we have to learn in our really just limited amount of time in graduate school. And so what ends up happening as therapists go out into the field, many often specialize in certain areas, and you may not even realize all the different things that a speech therapist can do.
Does that make it difficult for parents? Because to say, I'm going to go take my kid to a speech therapist, there's such a broad range of what's involved in speech therapy that if that therapist doesn't do what you need them to do, then maybe their specialty's over here and your child's over here, you're not going to get very effective therapy from that particular therapist, right? I mean, should you look for therapists that match up real well with what that they specialize in, what your child needs?
If you can find a therapist that specializes in your child's needs, I would absolutely look for that and try to support that work. In terms of this podcast, working with kids with autism, it's really important to have a speech therapist who has some more experience with language and in neurodiverse strategies and positive types of therapies to help kids with autism. Most therapists will not specialize in just one aspect. They might choose a few that they're interested in. I am one of those. But yes, it can be very helpful to find a therapist that meets your child's needs if you can't do that.
How would I go about that if I were a parent, Chloe? Let's say I just had a child that was diagnosed and that said they need ABA-OT and speech. And so I call a speech clinic in town and I say, hey, I need my child. They just were diagnosed. How would I know that that therapist is maybe a good fit or has experience with what I need, what my child's needs are?
Sure. There are a lot of different settings that you can get speech therapy in. School is a very common setting, outpatient clinics. Some therapists will come into your homes, private practices. So if you were trying to go more of maybe a private practice, outpatient clinic type of setting, I would recommend that parents look at the website to see what is listed as services that they provide. That's usually where they will give more information of the specialties that they offer, and be looking for information talking about autism. So you would know that would be a better place to place your bets on. What I would also say is that it's going to take some time for a speech therapist to really build rapport with your child. So if you do find a speech therapist that advertises online that they work with kids with autism and you don't feel like they completely mesh on the first day, that's okay. It's going to take time for the therapist to get to know your child, for the child to get to know your therapist, and make sure you give it some time for their relationship to develop.
Absolutely. What can you walk us through a little bit of what does the first stages of that treatment look like? I take my child in. Is there an assessment that's done? How does that assessment work? Multiple assessments? When can I expect my child to start? once they have received that assessment?
Yeah. So an evaluation is going to need to be happen is there's going to need to be an evaluation first. If you're in the schools, the evaluation will happen in the schools. All this depends on the setting. Usually it takes about an hour or so, but some places might be more thorough and go more in depth. Once you get that evaluation set up, typically it's going to involve a parent questionnaire that might be filled out during the evaluation or before the evaluation. And there's going to need to be some time of observation. If the therapist can, they like to observe your child in the classroom, maybe observing them in the home, observing them alone in play, observing them with you in play. They want to get a really good sense of what your child's skills are naturally, because an evaluation is this very unnatural setup time where we're trying to get a really good idea of their skills. So the observation time is really important. There's also going to be a period of standardized tests, and these standardized tests are to get some baseline data about your child's skills and to also give us some hard data to justify why they need therapy. So in other words, why insurance should pay for your child's speech therapy. This is very important. Some of these tests are going to use pictures, some have toys or manipulatives for your child to use, and I wrote down special considerations for the bilingual and multilingual household. If you live in a bilingual or a multilingual household, it is really important that you have a clinician that is going to address all of the languages. So, for example, if you speak English and Spanish in your household, you need to have a speech therapist that will evaluate your child using both languages. If your child doesn't even speak Spanish, is only speaking English, but is hearing both English and Spanish at home, you still need to address both of those languages. If the therapist only is evaluating you in English and they're ignoring a whole other set of your child's language skills, there might be things that they only understand in one language and not in the other. So if you are multilingual or bilingual, make sure you either find a therapist that can address both of those languages or know that you have the right to have a translator in there to help facilitate that. Then you should be receiving your results back in about 1 to 4 weeks. In my practice, I will give my families a call within 24 to 48 hours to give a general understanding of the evaluation results, and then I give them a full written evaluation 2 weeks later. But some places take longer or shorter depending on their need. And from that evaluation, you're going to get some information about the frequency of sessions. 2 times a week for 30 minutes is going to be very common, but I've seen 3 times a week for 30 minutes, 4 times a week. Maybe it's for 45 minutes. Maybe it's alone or in a group setting. There's a lot of different options for the frequency, but the speech therapist should be recommending the exact amount that they think would be most needed.
You had mentioned having a translator. Is that something that insurance is required to cover so that the child is evaluated in their natural language? Do you know?
That's a really good question. In my experience, a lot of insurances don't even cover the evaluation, I'll be honest. So I'm not exactly sure those specifics. I do know that if you are getting your evaluation through the school system, that is a necessity and a right. But if you're choosing to go the private practice route, I don't know what the rules and regulations are about that.
Okay. I feel like I heard that somewhere, but I didn't want to say that it was for sure. And I just was curious if you know.
I wish I knew the answer. I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. Yeah. So talk to us a little bit about what is a speech session going to look like? My child's been evaluated. They have their frequency of visits, and I go into my first few sessions and observe my child. What am I going to see as a parent?
So each session is going to vary depending on who your child is. Ideally, it should be a more play-based session, or those are what mine look like, but it's going to be individually tailored to your child's needs. So like I said, my therapy is more play-based. I'm multisensory, hands-on. Some therapists are going to prefer to be a bit more structured in what they offer, so you're going to see some variety. But it's very common to see speech therapists use books, toys, sensory activities, music, songs, maybe videos if that's appropriate. We're going to try to find activities that are going to help support your child's language needs while being really reinforcing and engaging for them as well.
Talk to me a little bit about how would I know, let's say my child's been receiving therapy for 3 months and my mom instincts telling me, I don't know that this is a good fit.
Yeah.
What are some red flags? Maybe that, not that the therapist is not a good therapist, but maybe it's just not the right fit for my child. What are some things that maybe would encourage me to seek out another therapist?
Yeah, I think that's a really important question for parents because, as I mentioned, you need to give some time for the child to build that relationship with the therapist. But if you start to have that mom instinct, I encourage you to trust your gut. But some real red flags that I would look out for is if the therapist is dismissing or ignoring your concerns. When parents come to me with their own concerns, I have to take that into consideration. We're a team, we're working together. I might give different recommendations. I'm going to tell them the knowledge base that I know and why I am doing these things to support your child. But if a parent comes to me saying, we want to work on certain things, or we don't feel like these needs are being met, and the therapist is ignoring that, that should be a concern. A big one to me is if you do not know what is happening behind that closed door. There's a lot of settings where there's a waiting room and the child is taken from the waiting room and goes back to the room, and the parents are sitting on the waiting room and have no idea what is happening. I personally have an open door policy and encourage parents to come in and out of sessions as much or as little as they want. Some parents want to use it as a break time. Some might feel that their kids aren't focusing as much in the sessions. That's completely fine. But I've also heard situations where parents are sitting out in the waiting room and hearing their child screaming, crying, and not allowed to go back and support their child. That is not okay. You should feel comfortable about what's happening. And I also tell my families, if you don't know what's happening behind our closed door, this is a really good time for us to have that quick phone call, me to give you a longer email letting you know what's happening. You should feel really well informed about what's happening in those sessions as well. Another red flag that I would say is if the sessions are disorganized or inconsistent or frequently canceled. Consistency is so important for all kids, but particularly kids with autism. I also think therapists need to be collaborating with other professionals. And the other one I would say, if the therapist isn't using strength-based therapy. So what that basically means is finding the skills that your child already has and using those as the building blocks, but instead of focusing on only what your child cannot do, using the strengths that they already have to continue to propel them along in therapy.
Hey, Chloe, one of the second before last point was talking about cooperation between disciplines as far as that goes.
Yeah.
And I know that in some cases, sometimes BCBAs and speech paths don't necessarily get along, or they may have different views. Could you address that, why that might be, and how does somebody go about resolving that? And how do you recognize it truly as a red flag? Because I think that's important, is you've got to have people that are team players for your child. If they're not going to be team players, they don't need to be there.
Yeah, I think a common scenario is that families find out their child is diagnosed with autism and they find all of the services that are at their disposal, which probably includes ABA and speech, and they take them all. And then as they're getting into that, they might start to hear about some tension happening. There's tension between speech and ABA, and it won't take a long Google search on the internet to find more about that. What I hear on speech therapist side is a great frustration for compliance-based therapy that is happening in ABA and treating language as a behavior. So as speech therapists, we have the most knowledge and understanding about language and are maybe using very specific language models, are maybe focusing on certain aspects. And if the BCBA isn't also working on those things, is working on language as a different function, it can clash with the work that we're doing. Now, what I will say is I have seen a lot of bad ABA therapy, but I've also seen a lot of bad speech therapy too. I've seen a lot of speech therapists not support the child's needs, that are doing what I don't think to be very supportive therapy. So I think it depends much more on the therapist that you're working with instead of just the general model of therapy. And Megan, I'd love to hear your thoughts about this as well.
I totally agree. I think sometimes there's BCBAs out there that are just really arrogant and think they can do it all. And I'm not one of those. I'm a firm believer and I have my path and I'm really great at my skill set, but there are sometimes things I don't know a lot about. And so that's where I need to lean heavily on a speech therapist and say, hey, we've looked at this from a behavior standpoint. I'm not getting anywhere. Can you help me out, speech? Help me understand this. Is this, what can we do to support the child? And I think you really hit the nail on the head when you were talking about not all language is behavior. That's what BCBAs see. That's what we understand. But I think it's important to consider other perspectives as well. It doesn't mean one is right, one is wrong. And unfortunately, there are professionals out there in all fields that are just not good practitioners. And so being able to decipher between that is very important. But I think one area that I have learned a lot about that is that as a BCBA, I'm now going to learn more about and read more about. Your mom has shared with me and you've shared with me, Chloe, is this Gestalt language learning model. And I wouldn't talk so much about it because we have so many kids out there that have that diagnosis of autism that are scripters, that are very echoic, delayed echolalia. And that having that knowledge and understanding of what you guys are seeing from that language standpoint and that language learning, I think is just so important, because then we can kind of tag team, if you will, and support that child as a whole in all aspects, not just 30 minutes twice a week or not in the 35 hours of ABA. We put it together, combine it so that child's getting the best quality therapy.
Yeah, absolutely.
So will you talk a little bit, you're the speech girl. I want you to talk a little bit about this model and what it is, how it kind of came about, and really educate. I know it's fairly new. You guys have seen some success with Colby using this approach. So would you mind kind of sharing what you've learned?
Yes, I am very excited to discuss Gestalt language development. So when most people think about normal language development, they think about their baby starting to babble, and that babble later becomes words, and that words becomes 2 words, and then phrases and sentences, and just gets beautifully built on. The one brick creates a whole wall. It just is this bottom up processing that we see. But really, there are 2 types of very normal language development. The other one being Gestalt language development. So instead of bottom up, it's actually top down, where the child is starting with these full chunks of language. It could be one phrase or it could be a long, lengthy paragraph that is meaningful to the child, broken down to one word, and then built upon to self-generated language from there. And it's really important to know what type of language processor your child is, because the therapy is going to completely change based on those needs. And then talking about the history a little bit, I have a whole slide with different research articles on there. So to start about a little bit of vocabulary before I talk more about the Gestalt language processors, I think it's important to talk about, you mentioned scripters or echolalia, Gestalt. These are all considered the same thing. And so these units of language could be echoed from something that they heard a few hours ago, days ago, weeks, months, or years ago, but there was some emotional connection to the script that was being said that helped it really be memorable and stick for that child. It can come from books or movies or TV shows, YouTube videos or songs.
Or radio talk shows.
Or Sesame Street.
Yeah, or Sesame Street.
Yeah.
For Colby, Colby listened. We used to listen to Dr. Laura all the time, and so the way Colby understood how to introduce people was how Dr. Laura would introduce their guests. It would be, Chloe, welcome to the program. And so whenever somebody walked into the room, Colby would say, So-and-so, welcome to the program.
Exactly.
It was very appropriate. And I don't know that we appreciated it at the time, but it was his way of saying, hello, how are you? That was his greeting.
Exactly. But it's this meaningful chunk of language that he acquired from somewhere else. And maybe if you don't know that reference or you've never heard him say it before, it feels out of context and bizarre and like he's just thinking about a radio program. But that's his language, that he knows how to engage in that certain conversation. And Dad, I'm so glad you brought up that one. I actually have a few of Colby's gestalts that we could chat about. And you'll see the second one is Rebecca. Welcome to the program. So,
okay.
that's exactly it. Yeah. So, and then Megan, you mentioned Sesame Street. So many of Colby's gestalts come from Sesame Street. A lot come from Count Von Count, but he also loves Guy Smiley, America's favorite game show host. That's the first one. Oh, I'm sorry, folks, but you all guessed wrong. You are not the winner. No prize for you. So that is, he says that whole phrase if I say something wrong. Like if I got a fact wrong, he will tell me that whole thing. And then, hey, what's wrong is something that he says when he's really upset and sad, because that's something that he has heard people say to him if they see him crying. Hey, what's wrong? It's a new record is what he says when he's seen something. He counts things and is always keeping stock of things. And so when something is a new number, he says it's a new record. 20 honks is in reference to his 20th birthday when I made him a honker birthday card.
That's
and it was a video recording. And my dad says, 20 honks in the background. So occasionally Colby will say in Dad's inflection, 20 honks. And then this last one, okay, love you too, I included because if you just read it, you think, oh, that's probably so sweet and meaningful. But actually, that's Colby's way of communicating, Mom, get off the phone. That's a very annoyed gestalt for him. So it's these phrases that he has that come from a different context that relate some type of language, but you have to kind of you have to do some detective work to understand exactly what the meaning is.
I just think that's so, and when you use Colby as the example, just knowing his language and the thing, bye mommy, go check email. It's like, okay, leave the room, Mom, like go do these things, but putting them in context. And I just think about other kids I've worked with over the years. And I'm like, oh, if I would have had this knowledge and known this to kind of look at it from that perspective, how I would have probably changed and shifted our intervention with them.
Mm-hmm, exactly.
What kind of success are you seeing out there with this, Chloe, with the Gestalt processing?
Yeah, I can give two examples. So I've got one child I started working with this last fall. There was the parents didn't suspect Gestalt language processing, just that he needed support with his expressive language skills. And as I was working with him, I started hearing these phrases getting repeated, and they seemed really out of context. So I recorded our session together, created a whole language sample, and found all these beautiful gestalts coming out there and got to figure out what the meaning was. Found out he really loves Paw Patrol and understand what the meaning is behind that. And I remember in one of those early sessions, I took one of his gestalts and I said it to him, and the way he stopped in play and looked at me as if he was being understood for the first time. No one had used his gestalt to him in that way. And he immediately, I don't remember what he said back, but we were connected because of that, because I validated his language. I have another child that I'm working with that is non-speaking still. So we actually have him on an alternative communication device that I've set up with lots of different buttons for him to press that will tell whole phrase gestalts. And from the moment I brought it out in our first session, he was attracted to using it, was using it to communicate basic wants and needs. And actually, I just worked with him this afternoon, and he went and grabbed some letters off of the table because he really loves letters. And I started singing the alphabet song, as one does. And this boy, he was in such delight, such glee, started jumping up and down and ran over and pressed the button that says, "This is so much fun." And Yes.
Oh
So
my gosh.
yeah.
Wow.
So these
Oh,
kids,
wow.
they have these feelings they want to be able to express, but it wasn't just that he was communicating, will you please sing this song? He was communicating to me, I really like this. I'm so glad we're having this shared joy experience together. And so having this understanding about Gestalt language processing and using these different therapy approaches, I'm seeing these kids make significantly faster progress because I'm teaching them language the way their brain is meant to absorb language.
So what does it look like, Chloe, when you're working through this model? Can a parent expect down the road for them does it put more context within their words, or does it help them kind of start to form their own sentences, their own communication, or is it more of the family having to kind of adapt their style of communication with their child? Does that make sense?
That does make sense. So this is something that is being talked about more recently. It's becoming more well known, more popular. But I have all these different research articles that you can see are from, not to get into the nitty gritty of the research articles, but I have these more to say that people were finding supportive research about this back in 1977, 1978, 1982, 1983, 1984, 85. This isn't new. People were having an understanding of how these kids support language, but it just wasn't, unfortunately, fell to the wayside. And then in 2012, Marge Blanc, she came out with the natural language acquisition framework, which beautifully outlines the natural language development of Gestalt language processors. So to quickly go through some of these, it starts with stage one, echolalia, where they're going to give these whole phrases, like the ones I shared about Colby. Rebecca, welcome to the program. And then in stage two, they might mix and match, or there's this trimming down or mitigation. So they might take half of one Gestalt and half of another Gestalt and put it together. So as my dad mentioned for welcome to the program, he might put someone else's name in there that wasn't mentioned on the program. Megan, welcome to the program. On this example, the stage one Gestalt is there's a monster at the end of this book, but the stage two is there's a monster. So, or as Colby says, I'm sorry, folks, no prize for you. Now he'll just say, I'm sorry, folks. So he has that trimming down ability. In stage three, we start to see it going down to single words or two words combination. In this example, it gets monster, scary monster, monster red. And this is a really exciting stage where this idea is now fully freed from the Gestalt. The idea of a monster for this child maybe could not be discussed before unless it was in the full Gestalt. But now the idea of what a monster is and that it can be scary and that it can be red is fully understood and comprehended. And then stages 4 through 6 is they're starting to take that freed word and use it in more self-generated. And the upper stages are just helping them expand upon their grammar skills, and sentences are getting more complex. And so to go back to your question, Megan, about what this might mean for families, you might be hearing your kids using some of these gestalts or phrases. If there's a family listening, they might know, oh, I know exactly what it is that my kid says that goes like this. So when we support these gestalts, they can get to this self-generated language. What we have been seeing in a lot of these kids who haven't been supported through a Gestalt language framework is that their speech gets stuck, that they have their phrases and they're not getting to a point where the words are getting freed. And they might have lots of words and nouns that they have been taught, and they can label a lot of things, or maybe they have some phrases that were also explicitly taught. I want this, or a certain phrase like that. But we're not using their own language to help them support along. So we see kids getting stuck a lot. So it's really important to know about this.
So it's almost like you're taking the big picture and trimming it down versus taking the small picture and trimming it up is how I kind of, when I think about language. That's just
exactly.
One of the things that comes across my mind is I see on a lot of the boards and postings, people are saying, my child is using these phrases over and over again. How do I get them to stop it? That's the exact wrong approach here, right? I mean, you don't want them to stop it. You want to learn how to channel that into full-blown language.
Yes. I'm so glad you said that, because I have seen a lot of kids that their therapist told them, stop, or they would ignore them when they started doing that. And, you need to start having your words and having 2-word combinations. And there's a reason why these kids weren't making progress through that. To me, it's the equivalent of asking a left-handed kid to write with their right hand, or asking a kid who needs glasses to not wear their glasses in classroom. This is the skills that these kids come with, and we need to support them in the way that they're processing the world.
If I were interested in finding a Gestalt language speech path, where would I go? What would I look for on something like this, Chloe?
Yes. So all of this information that I learned through the Meaningful Speech website. And there is an online course that I took. If you are wanting to find more information about this, I highly recommend that you go to the Meaningful Speech website. There's a blog on there. They have an Instagram account that's constantly uploading information. If you are looking for a therapist to work with your child through this framework, there is actually an online database of therapists that have finished the course and are listed on there. I am listed on that website. So you can find there are more and more meaningful speech trained Gestalt language therapists out there every single day. So check and see if there's one in your area. And the other thing that I can mention is that if you do not have immediate access to a therapist who is trained in Gestalt language processing, I would recommend that consultations are a really good option for these families. And actually, I have been doing consultations for families as well as for already in place therapy teams, working with them to support their children through this framework. This will look like them doing video recordings of their child or sending me language samples, and I will start to analyze them and give them training on how their child is processing speech, give them ideas about how to support them at home, and supporting their own team. I have other BCBAs I'm working alongside with. So that's something that I can do. You can actually do it. I can support families nationwide. It doesn't actually, consultations don't have to just happen in your home state. But so if you cannot find someone who can do regular therapy with your child who's trained in Gestalt language processing, I highly recommend looking into parent consultations as another route.
Great. I can certainly see where this would be a godsend for a lot of families that are out there that are really struggling with this. Because I know for us, Colby's done everything pretty much backwards. That's just the way he developed. So I'm sure that there's a lot of parents out there that are thinking the same thing. So this takes advantage of that. It doesn't look at it as a weakness. It just looks at it as just another way of learning. So
it's so common with our kids on the spectrum. You have more kids that are using this type of communication and this type of language than not. So, I mean, I'm so thankful for you guys for introducing it and sharing it with me, because it's like this whole nother part of my brain is like opened up to really kind of look at that and kind of put a perspective out there and sharing it. So, Chloe, I thank you so much for sharing this with us. Any other tips or tricks you think that would be helpful for families that may want to know a little bit more about this?
I think the other thing that I might suggest is, even if your child is not speaking yet, that doesn't mean that they're not a Gestalt language processor. I mentioned about the child that I'm working with that I'm using alternative device. Some common signs of this could be if they're using unintelligible strings of rich intonation. The kids who are analytic language processors are called word babies, and the ones who are Gestalt language processors are called intonational babies. They're always saying their phrases using the same intonation. They're really attracted to music and to songs and to how things are said. So even if you hear that they are singing or humming tunes but not using the words, they might be a Gestalt language processor. The studying of media. I mean, you commonly see kids with autism on their phones and iPads going back and forth on YouTube, trying to get it right. And some people see that just as stimming, but I see that as studying the intonation that is happening with their words. And they're really trying to understand all the complexities of what is being said in that clip. Maybe they're studying other songs or maps. Hyperlexia, which is when the child has an affinity for reading. For example, Colby is hyperlexic. He was reading and writing before he could talk. This is most hyperlexics learn through Gestalt language processing. And as I mentioned earlier about getting stuck, if you are trying these other analytic language approaches and you're not getting the success, trying a Gestalt language approach, there are no downsides to using it. if you use full phrases and full sentences with an analytic language processor, they're going to learn the words that are there. They're still going to pick up and learn words naturally. If you only use words with a Gestalt language processor, they will not pick it up. So there are no negatives to at least trying using this approach.
That's cool. That's important. That's very important.
Cool. Well, Chloe, let's say somebody wanted to find out more about you. How would they find out more about Chloe, or how may they contact you?
Absolutely. So my business is called Cope Speech Therapy, and you can look me up at copespeechtherapy.com. You can also find me on my socials on Facebook and Instagram. My handle is at Cope Speech Therapy. If you have any questions or want to reach out, you can even reach me over email at chloe@copespeechtherapy.com.
Cool. Well, and Megan, I know that you've got a website that's got a lot of additional materials, and we haven't really talked about that. If somebody was looking for your website, what might be some of the things they could find on your website to help them
Absolutely.
in this process?
I have, for any families that have recently received a diagnosis of autism, I do have a first steps checklist that they can download off of my website, as well as some of the top 10 questions to ask if you are getting ready to start your child in ABA therapy. What do I want to ask that provider, and what the answers should be to those questions? Not just the questions, but the right answers too that you want to hear. So you can check me out at hoppertconsulting.com if you have any questions or want to gain more insight, or if I can be of assistance with anything. You can email me at hoppertconsultingllc@gmail.com, and then also follow me on my socials at Hopper Consulting. So Scott, you want to talk a little bit about the Hills and how they're supporting families with children with special needs?
Yeah, I'm a member of the Hills Church that's located. We actually have 3 campuses, one in North Richland Hills, one in West Fort Worth, and the one that I attend in Keller. We are actively involved in helping families with special needs kids. We really want you to be able to have a place where you can connect and worship with us. We have respite nights that are available. We're also doing some marriage and family enrichment for families with special needs kids. So we're just a really active church that wants to reach out to the special needs community. If you want more information, would like to attend one of our services, we would love to have you. We actually, during our Sunday morning services, we have a special place just for your special needs kids and trained childcare, so that you can feel comfortable, that they're in a safe place, that they're in a learning environment, and you can go worship with the rest of your family. So please feel free to contact me. I'll make sure that you're put in the right direction as far as that goes. I'd also like to just mention too, for any of you that are concerned about where you stand spiritually, or would like to have prayer or anything like that, please feel free to give me an email. I'll be happy to hook up with you and see what I can do to help you out.
We appreciate you guys tuning in, and thank you so much, Chloe, for sharing all of your brain power. Hopefully there will be families that will be blessed and get them down the rabbit hole of learning more about this approach and it being successful for their child. So
you can see why I'm so proud of her, Megan. Yeah, I think she's a rock star.
Yeah. She is.
Absolutely.
Oh, man.
I'm going to embarrass you a little bit, sweetheart. That's all. Okay.
It's your
I'm
show.
still your dad.
It's your show.
Well, guys, thanks for those that are listening. Thank you so much for joining our program, and we look forward to seeing you on our next one. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, guys.